The Jedi Council chamber existed in permanent twilight. Light filtered through stained transparisteel windows that had been catching the Coruscant sunset for 10,000 years. The light fell in colored bands across the circular floor, making shadows of the seated masters into something that looked almost monolithic, ancient judges considering questions that shouldn't have answers. Today they looked panicked. Anakin Skywalker stood in the center of the chamber, but he was not alone. Padmé Amidala stood beside him, not behind, not separated by the formal distance the Jedi insisted on for accused heretics. Beside. Her hand rested on his shoulder, and the gesture was not supplication, it was declaration. It said, "I am here. This is real. He is mine." The chamber fell into a silence that had texture, that had weight. Mace Windu's jaw tightened. His optical implants, the result of a lightsaber duel that had cost him an eye, reflected the colored light like warning signals. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, which meant the anger underneath was significant. "This is unprecedented. Anakin, explain yourself." Anakin's hand found Padmé's, and the gesture was visible to everyone because it was meant to be visible. "There is nothing to explain," Anakin said, his voice steady in the way it had never been before. "Padmé and I are married. We have been for 3 months. I'm telling the Council now because hiding it is what created the conflict in the first place. No more secrets." Ki-Adi-Mundi shifted forward, his elongated skull catching the light. "The Jedi Code forbids attachment. Marriage is the ultimate expression of attachment. Therefore, marriage is forbidden." "The logic is clear," Anakin replied, and his voice carried something the younger Jedi who studied under him had begun to recognize: clarity. "The logic is also catastrophically wrong." Mace Windu rose from his seat, not a dramatic gesture, a measured one, a threat delivered through physical positioning. "You dare lecture us on the code? I dare speak truth to you," Anakin said. "For my entire time with the Order, I've been fighting my own nature, fighting my fear of loss, fighting my connection to people I love. That fighting, that was the instability. That was what made me vulnerable to manipulation." Padmé's grip on his shoulder tightened slightly, not nervous, supportive. "My marriage to Padmé," Anakin continued, "did not make me unstable. It made me clear. For the first time in my life, I'm not at war with myself, and the Order wants to call that a violation of the code." Yoda's eyes opened. The ancient master had been meditating, or appearing to meditate. With Yoda, the distinction was often unclear. He was 900 years old and looked like someone had carved wisdom out of wood and given it a lightsaber. When he moved deliberately. "A question I have," Yoda said, his voice the sound of something ancient, considering whether to change. "Love Padmé Amidala, you do?" The question was simple. The answer would determine everything. Anakin turned to look at Padmé directly, and the moment stretched. The entire Jedi Council, 12 masters in their seats, younger Jedi standing in observation galleries, all watched him consider how to answer the most honest question anyone had asked him in years. "More than I love the Force," Anakin said, "more than I love the Order, more than I love myself." The chamber erupted, not into argument. Jedi debated with more control than that, but into Vox transmission, private conversations across the noosphere, encrypted channels carrying information at speeds flesh could never match. Mace Windu was transmitting rapidly to a faction of Orthodox masters. Stas Ali and Ajan Kohler were having their own conversation. Ki-Adi-Mundi was accessing historical precedent records, pulling up 10,000 years of Jedi doctrine. But Yoda remained silent. The ancient master rose from his seat with a deliberation that suggested each movement was a decision, an argument with gravity and entropy, and 10 centuries of accumulated exhaustion. He walked toward Anakin and Padmé, and the conversations in the chamber quieted, because when Yoda moved toward something, the universe generally had the courtesy to shut up and watch. He stood before them, his eyes barely reaching Anakin's sternum, his expression unreadable in the way that only things that had lived for 900 years could manage. "Wise, you believe you are?" Yoda asked. "No, Master," Anakin said. I believe I'm telling the truth. Wisdom is something else. Indeed. Yoda looked at Padmé directly. Love him, you do? With everything I am, Padmé said, her voice steady in a way that suggested she'd been preparing for this answer her entire life. And I don't regret it. And I never will. Yoda was quiet for 4.7 seconds, long enough for the chamber to recognize that the ancient master was actually considering, rather than simply preparing a rejection. The code. Tell it to me. Mace Windu will, Yoda said finally. The exact words. Mace Windu's expression suggested he'd just been asked to recite his own death sentence. But he stood, and his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of tradition. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. Yoda listened to the entire recitation. Then he looked back at Yoda, and something in his ancient face had shifted. Changed, the code has not, Yoda said, but changed, our interpretation of it has not had to. Mace Windu stiffened. Master, surely you're not suggesting. Suggesting, I am. That attachment and passion are not the same thing, Yoda interrupted, his voice carrying a power that made the chamber itself seem to listen more carefully. Attachment to outcome, that creates suffering, fear of loss, that breeds desperation. But connection, love, these are not forbidden by the code, these are not mentioned by the code. Because they were assumed to be understood as violations, Ki-Adi-Mundi said, but his voice had lost certainty. Assumed, yes, Yoda agreed. But assumption is not the same as truth. 10,000 years, the Order has taught that love is weakness. And 10,000 years, I have been wrong about this. The chamber went very quiet. Master, Obi-Wan Kenobi said, standing from his position in the observation gallery, if we accept this precedent, what does it mean for the Order's fundamental teachings? Obi-Wan had been Anakin's master, the man who'd brought him to the temple as a child, the man who'd spent years training him, molding him, trying to control the chaos of his emotions through discipline. If anyone had a right to object, it was Obi-Wan. Instead, he walked down to the center of the chamber. I trained Anakin, Obi-Wan said, his voice measured in a way that suggested he'd been thinking about this for much longer than the last few moments. I spent years telling him that his attachments would be his downfall, that his love would make him weak, that he needed to transcend his feelings to become a proper Jedi. He looked at Yoda. Master, with respect, I think I was wrong. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of something monumental shifting. Mace Windu stood abruptly. This is not a debate. The code is absolute. If we compromise on this, this is not, Yoda said quietly. Evolution, this is. 10,000 years of error, being corrected. Painful this is, but correct it is. Yoda turned to face the full council. Vote. We will. Anakin Skywalker and Padmé Amidala, their marriage. Accept it. The Order will, or accept it. The Order will not. Decide. You must. Now. The voting was not unanimous. 6 masters voted to accept. Yoda, Obi-Wan, Stas Ali, Agen Kohler, Coleman Esh, and Jaro Tapal. 4 voted against. Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, Depa Billaba, and Saesee Tiin. 2 abstained. Oppo Rancisis and Jedi Master Jet Lucas. Anakin had expected something more dramatic than a show of hands. But the Jedi didn't do theatrical. They did bureaucratic. They did procedural. They did the slow work of changing institutions through voting and documentation. But it was real. The marriage was accepted. Mace Windu's expression suggested he was tasting something toxic. He looked at Anakin with an intensity that made the younger man understand, viscerally, that his relationship with the Council's most powerful warrior had just fundamentally changed, not into friendship, into something more complicated. This decision is noted, Mace Windu said quietly, and I will respect it. But understand, Anakin, this is a test. If your marriage becomes the excuse for a fall, If you use your connection to Padmé as justification for breaking the code's other laws, there will be consequences. I understand, Anakin said. But what he didn't say, what nobody in the chamber seemed to notice, was the moment when the tension in his shoulders released, when the constant low-level anxiety that had been his background radiation for his entire life simply quieted, like someone had finally turned off an alarm that had been ringing for years. Padmé's hand remained on his shoulder. Somewhere in Coruscant's upper levels, in an office that occupied a corner of the government district that dealt in power the way other offices dealt in credits, Chancellor Palpatine sat at his desk and felt something shift in the Force. Not violently, not as disruption, as dampening. There had been a particular quality to Anakin Skywalker's presence in the Force. A turbulence, a desperation, a constant oscillation between raw power and the fear that he would lose the people he loved. It was a familiar frequency, a manipulable frequency, the frequency that Darth Sidious had been tuning his entire plan around. That frequency had just changed. The turbulence was quieter, more stable. The desperation had not been eliminated, but it had been integrated, incorporated into something coherent rather than chaotic. Palpatine's perfect plan, which had been counting on Anakin's fear-driven vulnerability, had just become substantially more complicated. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over Coruscant's endless architecture. The city was beautiful in its way, a monument to civilization stretched so far that it had developed its own gravity, its own logic, its own sense of inevitability. But inevitability could change. He would have to reconsider everything. In the Jedi Temple, in a meditation chamber high enough to overlook most of Coruscant's upper layers, Anakin and Padmé stood together, and for the first time, they did not do it in secret. Anakin's lightsaber hung at his side. Padmé wore the formal robes of a senator, which looked incongruous against the backdrop of stone and transparisteel, but she'd insisted on coming directly from council sessions. No pretense, no hiding. You did that, Padmé said quietly. We did that, Anakin corrected. I couldn't have done this without you standing beside me. Literally, that gesture mattered. The council was expecting me to be passive, a victim of your attachment, needing them to cure you of loving me. Padmé smiled slightly. I wanted to show them that love isn't a disease requiring treatment. Anakin's hands found hers, and the gesture was visible through the chamber's transparisteel walls to anyone who might be watching, which some probably were. What now? Padmé asked. Now? Anakin considered the question. For years, his internal monologue had been screaming in conflict. Duty versus love, order versus Padmé, the impossible choice that society insisted on. That conflict had been his background radiation, his constant condition. Now it was gone. Now, Anakin said, I teach, I serve the order, I learn, and I do it as myself, not as someone fighting to suppress who I am. That sounds almost peaceful, Padmé said. It is, Anakin replied. It's terrifying. They stood together as the light fell across Coruscant, and neither of them could know that the peace they'd achieved was the calm before catastrophe, that the stability Anakin had found would allow him to see things the desperate version of him would have missed, that the clarity of mind that came from no longer fighting himself would illuminate paths that desperation had obscured. Neither of them could know that by accepting Anakin's marriage, the Jedi Council had not solved the problem. They had changed the problem into something they had absolutely no framework for addressing. 3 months later, the meditation training chambers echoed with the sound of lightsabers meeting. Not in combat, in practice kata, the careful work of learning to hear what the Force was saying beneath the noise of intention. Anakin moved through the form with a precision that made watching him uncomfortable in a particular way. It looked too easy, like someone who'd finally stopped fighting gravity and learned to flow with it instead. Ahsoka Tano, his Padawan, the young Togruta who'd been assigned to him during the Clone Wars, watched from the side of the chamber, her blue skin catching the light, her white eyes tracking every movement. "Master," she said when he finished, his blade deactivating with a snap of heated air. "You're different. Anakin turned to her, and his expression carried something that was dangerously close to happiness, a thing that had been absent from his face for most of Ahsoka's service under him. "Different how?" he asked, though he clearly knew. "You're not fighting anymore. Before, when you trained, it was like you were at war with yourself. Now it's like you're finally just here, practicing, not punishing yourself for something." Anakin moved to the bench and sat down, gesturing for Ahsoka to join him. "That's because I'm not fighting myself anymore," he said. "The marriage to Padmé, it wasn't just the Council accepting it, it was me accepting it. Accepting that I'm allowed to love someone and still be a good Jedi. Accepting that I'm allowed to want things beyond duty." Ahsoka was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't know that was allowed." "It wasn't," Anakin said. "Now it is. That's what changes when an institution decides to evolve." He looked at her seriously. "The Order taught you that attachment leads to suffering, right? That you need to transcend personal connection to achieve clarity?" "Yes, Master. That's not true. Isolation leads to suffering. The things we do in secret lead to suffering. But love, real love, acknowledged and honored, that doesn't make you weak, Ahsoka. It makes you real. And real people are stronger than the people we pretend to be." Ahsoka processed this, her expression suggesting that something fundamental about her understanding was being reorganized. "Does this mean," she started, "means that someday, if you find someone worth loving, the Order won't demand that you choose between them and your calling?" Anakin finished. "You'll be able to do both, like I'm doing now." In the halls of the Jedi Temple, Obi-Wan Kenobi walked alongside his former student, not as master and apprentice anymore, but as equals. Their relationship had shifted when the Council voted to accept the marriage, had shifted again when they debated the implications in private, had settled into something more honest than it had been before. "I need to ask you something," Obi-Wan said, and they walked toward the observation platforms that overlooked Coruscant. "And I need you to answer with complete honesty. Are you happy?" Anakin didn't hesitate. "Yes, more genuinely happy than I've been since I arrived at the temple as a child. The happiness is sustainable, not going to collapse into desperation when something threatens it. The happiness is sustainable because it's based on reality now, not on need," Anakin said. "I love Padmé. The Order acknowledges that love. The love doesn't demand anything impossible, so there's no unsustainable foundation beneath it." Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment, looking out over the city planet. "I was wrong," he said finally. "When I trained you, I was wrong. I believed that emotional suppression was wisdom, that transcendence meant denial. I was so concerned with preventing your fall that I didn't realize I was creating the exact conditions for it. You taught me everything I needed to be strong," Anakin said. "You just did it from an incomplete understanding of what strength actually is." "Yes," Obi-Wan agreed, "and now I have to consider how many other teachings were incomplete. How many Jedi are suffering because the Order has been wrong about fundamental things." In the senatorial district, Padmé worked in her office, reviewing military deployment statistics that made no logical sense given current separatist threat levels. She'd spent her entire career in the Senate learning to read what numbers actually meant beneath their surface. And these numbers were wrong in a very specific way. They suggested preparation for something larger than the current conflict. Much larger. She opened a secure Vox channel to Anakin. "Are you free?" she asked. "Always for you," he replied. It was a standing joke between them now, the absolute availability that marriage created, the ability to admit that someone mattered more than protocol. "I need to show you something, and I need you to tell me if my instincts are right." 15 minutes later, Anakin was in her office, looking at the deployment data with the eye of someone who'd spent the Clone Wars managing military logistics. "This doesn't match separatist threat," he said immediately. "This is preparation for something systemic, something that requires military presence across entire regions, not just at conflict points." "Exactly what I thought," Padmé said. "But I don't know what the threat is. The Senate isn't talking about anything that would justify this. The separatist conflict is contained. So what is the military preparing for?" Anakin's expression had shifted into the focused calm that came from him engaging in tactical analysis. "We should bring this to the Council," he said. "And say what? That I notice the numbers are weird?" Padmé smiled. "I need actual evidence, not suspicions." But the seed had been planted. The awareness that beneath the surface of normal operations, something larger was being prepared. And unlike the Anakin of years past, this Anakin didn't immediately panic about it. He simply noted it, filed it, and continued with his day. Because panic was what happened when you were afraid. And Anakin was no longer afraid of the unknown. He was just curious about it. In his office, in a section of government that dealt in the kinds of power that didn't advertise themselves, Palpatine continued his recalculations. Anakin Skywalker had become clear. That was the problem. Desperation created tunnel vision. It created manipulable patterns. But clarity made people see things they shouldn't see. The marriage had been a gift, not to Anakin, to Palpatine's long-term planning. It had accelerated the timeline. It had made the need for immediate action obvious. The clone army was still being prepared. The political machinations were still advancing. But now it was clear that Palpatine couldn't wait for Anakin to willingly fall into darkness. The marriage had prevented that inevitability, so Palpatine would have to force the fall or eliminate the problem. Neither option was ideal, but the game was in motion now, and it was time to move toward endgame. He activated secure communications, activate Protocol 66 preparation. He transmitted to the military commanders who served him. Move to highest alert without triggering alarms. I want the clone army ready for immediate mobilization within the month. The response came back. Understood, Chancellor. Palpatine looked out over Coruscant and understood something that very few people ever understood. That happiness and peace were transitional states. That they inevitably led to the moment when they had to be defended. That the universe had a tendency to test everything worth keeping. Anakin's marriage had changed the game, but it hadn't changed what was coming. It had simply made the outcome more interesting. 18 days later, in a private meeting that was supposed to be routine briefing on military strategies, Palpatine looked at Anakin and made a decision that would reshape everything. The Chancellor's office was designed to exude power through subtle means. The desk was positioned with the window behind it, so visitors always saw Palpatine silhouetted against Coruscant. The lighting was set to emphasize the geometric precision of the room. Every element suggested control, authority, the weight of someone who understood how systems worked. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Palpatine said to Anakin, his voice carrying the warmth that he deployed at default settings. Not excessive, not calculated seeming. The specific temperature of a man who was perpetually delighted to see whoever he happened to be encountering. "There are matters that the Council is not aware of. Matters that I believe you have a right to know." Anakin tensed, not with fear, with attention. "What matters, Chancellor?" "The clone army," Palpatine said directly. "Tell me what you know about it." The military commissioned it during the Separatist crisis. It was produced by the Kaminoans using genetic templates. It's been invaluable in combat operations. Anakin paused. "Why?" "Because what I'm about to tell you is not what the Council knows," Palpatine said, "and it is not what the military has been authorized to tell you. But I believe you deserve the truth." He activated a holo display and data appeared. Genetic codes, military command structures, something that made Anakin's eyes widen slightly. "The clone army was not simply commissioned," Palpatine explained. "It was commissioned with specific constraints. Built into their neural structures are programmed orders that will activate under specific conditions. When I give the signal, every single clone trooper in the galaxy will simultaneously turn on the Jedi and execute them. Every single one." Anakin was silent for 2.3 seconds. Then, "That's impossible. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are the only Jedi I trust with this information," Palpatine said, and his voice carried something that sounded dangerously like genuine affection. "Because I wanted to give you the opportunity to decide whether the Order deserves loyalty." "What do you want from me?" Anakin asked carefully. "Nothing. Palpatine replied. "I simply want you to understand that there are forces moving in directions the Council has not authorized, using methods they have not approved, and that perhaps your loyalty to them should be reconsidered, given their willingness to keep secrets from you." He paused. "Your wife is a senator. She's already noticed the military preparations, hasn't she? Already questioned why the deployment patterns don't match the separatist threat." Anakin said nothing, which was response enough. "That's because the military preparations aren't for fighting separatists," Palpatine continued. "They're for the moment when the clone order activates. The military is preparing for the Jedi Order to be eliminated from the galaxy, and for there to be nothing anyone can do to stop it." He moved closer to Anakin, his expression carrying something that resembled sympathy, but which was actually careful manipulation, delivered with precision. "I tell you this because I believe that when that moment comes, you should have a choice. Stand with the Jedi and die alongside them, or stand with those of us who will survive what's coming. That's the choice I'm giving you." Anakin looked at the holo display, at the genetic codes, at the documented evidence that the foundation of the military apparatus was compromise, built on hidden programming. And then he recognized the pattern. Not consciously, not through analytical reasoning alone, but through that thing the marriage had given him, clarity. The ability to see manipulation not as threat, but as structure, as pattern, as something that could be understood and addressed. This was manipulation, the sophisticated kind, the kind that worked by telling truth mixed with false implication. "You're telling me information that's real," Anakin said slowly. "The clone army does have programming, that part is true, but you're using that truth to imply that the Council knew about it and kept it secret from me, that the Council prioritizes the clone army over my loyalty." Palpatine's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in his stance, a subtle repositioning that suggested calculation. "The Council did keep this from you," Palpatine said. "I can verify that. I can show you the records of what they knew and when they knew it." "Possibly," Anakin admitted, "but not for the reason you're implying. They kept it from me because—" He paused, understanding crystallizing. "Because they were trying to protect Padmé. If I knew the clone army was compromised, I'd move to protect her, and moving to protect her would compromise my position in the Order. The Council was trying to keep me stable by keeping me ignorant." "And does that not anger you?" Palpatine asked. "It does," Anakin said, "but the anger is clarifying, not enslaving. The anger tells me that the Council made a choice, and the choice was wrong, and I need to confront them about it, not turn against them." Palpatine was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, a genuine smile, which was more terrifying than anger would have been because it suggested he was genuinely impressed by Anakin's reasoning. "Your marriage has made you interesting, General," Palpatine said. "When you were desperate, you were predictable. Now you're unpredictable. That's problematic for planning that depends on predictability. Then perhaps you should reconsider your plans," Anakin said. "Perhaps I should accelerate them instead," Palpatine replied. Anakin walked directly from Palpatine's office to Obi-Wan's chambers, and the speed of his movement suggested urgency rather than planning. Obi-Wan was meditating when Anakin entered. The older Jedi opened his eyes immediately. 10 years of warfare had conditioned them both to recognize when someone needed immediate presence. "Palpatine just told me that the clone army has programmed orders to turn on the Jedi," Anakin said without preamble. "He showed me genetic codes, military documentation, everything, and he wanted me to understand that the Council kept this from me." Obi-Wan stood slowly, his expression shifting into the careful neutrality of someone processing information that changed multiple equations simultaneously. "Is he lying?" Anakin asked. "About the clone army having programming?" "No, that part is true," Obi-Wan said. "I was authorized to know about it after you were knighted. The order came from Yoda directly. And I wasn't told because we were trying to keep you stable," Obi-Wan said, and the words carried the weight of a decision that had been made collectively, authoritatively, and was now being questioned. "You and Padmé. The Council believed that if you knew about the clone programming, You'd panic. You'd move to protect her, and that would make you vulnerable. So you lied, Anakin said. We withheld information. That's not the same thing. To the person being withheld from, it absolutely is the same thing, Anakin replied. Obi-Wan, I understand the Council's reasoning. But Palpatine is right about one thing. I had a right to know. Not so I would turn against the Order, but so I could make informed decisions about my own safety and Padmé's safety. Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. Then, you're right, and I'm going to help you bring this to Yoda. The Council made a mistake. It was made with good intentions, but it was a mistake. In the Council chamber, with all available masters present, Anakin presented what Palpatine had told him. The response was not denial or anger. It was something worse, acknowledgement. We were wrong, Yoda said, after listening to the entire report. Protect you by lying, we tried. Protect you, we failed. The truth should have been yours from the moment you were assigned to understand Jedi procedures. The bigger issue, Mace Windu said, and his voice carried the tone of someone who was beginning to understand that one problem was actually a much larger problem, is what Palpatine is planning. He didn't tell you this to recruit you. He told you to destabilize you, to see if learning about the clone programming would make you turn. He told me that my marriage made me unpredictable, Anakin said. He said that accelerates his timeline. He's preparing to move. Then we need to move first, Stas Ali said. We need to investigate Palpatine directly. Discover what he's planning, and if he is the Sith, Ki-Adi-Mundi asked. The question hung in the chamber. Then we face a conspiracy larger than anything we've encountered, Yoda said. Political infiltration, military compromise, institutional betrayal, all of it. If Palpatine is Sith, then the entire structure of the Republic is compromised. And we have no proof that can stand up to Senate scrutiny, Mace Windu added. If we accuse the Chancellor without evidence that survives legal examination, we look like we're attempting a coup. Then we find evidence, Anakin said. We investigate Palpatine. We bring it to the Senate. We do this the way the Republic is supposed to work. Yoda looked at him, and the ancient master's expression carried something that might have been respect or might have been acknowledgement of the complexity they were now facing. Search, we will, Yoda said, carefully, and together, because alone we are vulnerable to exactly the manipulation that Palpatine has been planning. 3 weeks of investigation revealed the scope of what Palpatine had actually been building. It wasn't just the clone programming. It was Senate corruption, military command structure infiltration, political allies positioned across a dozen worlds, financial networks that traced back to accounts that shouldn't have existed, and at the center of it all, evidence that Palpatine was Darth Sidious, that the Chancellor of the Republic was a Sith Lord who had been orchestrating galactic events for 2 decades. The evidence came from Anakin and Padmé working together, Padmé using her Senate connections to access financial records and military deployment data, Anakin using Force sensitivity and Jedi training to verify the information and trace it back to sources. The combination of political knowledge and Force insight created something neither could have accomplished alone. When they presented it to the Council, Mace Windu's response was immediate and absolute. We move against him now, Mace said, before he realizes we've discovered the full scope of his conspiracy. Moving against the sitting Chancellor is tantamount to revolution, Ki-Adi-Mundi said, but his voice suggested he was past caring about semantics. If we're wrong, if we fail, the Jedi Order is destroyed as a threat to the Republic. If we do nothing, the Jedi Order is destroyed when the Clone Order activates, Anakin said flatly. At least this way, we're fighting instead of waiting to be executed. Yoda stood. To the Senate we go, the evidence we present, the Chancellor we expose, and let the democratic process decide whether his conspiracy stands or falls. And if the Senate is compromised, Stas Ali asked, then we will learn that the entire Republic is compromised, Yoda replied, and we will face that truth. The Senate session happened in the afternoon light. The great chamber filled with thousands of senators from dozens of worlds, all of them suddenly present, because the Jedi Order had called for emergency session, and no one dared refuse the request. Mace Windu presented the evidence: financial transfers that traced Palpatine's accounts to Sith holdings, military commands that contradicted official deployment records, clone army programming codes that matched the Chancellor's private security protocols. The evidence was irrefutable. Palpatine's response came in the form of a transmission that was suddenly broadcast across every channel in the Senate, in the military, across Coruscant itself. Activate Protocol 66. The clone army turned, but it was not instantaneous execution as it had been designed, because the Jedi had been warned, because the Jedi had been prepared, because Anakin's clarity and the Council's willingness to evolve had created a situation where the perfect trap had teeth marks from someone fighting back. Clone troopers, activated to kill their Jedi generals, found themselves facing Jedi who knew they were being turned on. The battles that erupted across 1,000 worlds were not executions. They were fights, and the Jedi, as individuals, were stronger than the clones. But in aggregate, in coordinated resistance across multiple worlds, the clone army was a tide. The Jedi Temple fell into siege. Stas Ali died defending the Grand Courtyard, her twin lightsabers blazing until the moment a clone sniper's shot found her. Agen Kolar fell in the archives, protecting historical records that would never now be preserved. Ki-Adi-Mundi, in the moment of choice between following his programming and his conscience, was killed by the men under his command who chose programming. But others escaped, because Anakin had positioned defenders, because Obi-Wan had evacuated the youngest Jedi through the temple's secret passages, because Yoda, ancient and terrible, had stood at the center of the assault and held the line long enough for others to survive. And Palpatine moved personally. He came to the temple not as diplomat, but as Sith Lord, his true face revealed, his power absolute. Lightning that could crack stone, combat skill that was supernatural, and the absolute confidence of someone who had been planning this moment for 20 years. Yoda faced him in the temple's central chamber. Mace Windu joined the battle. Anakin came last, and his presence changed the equation. Because Anakin wasn't fighting from desperation, wasn't fighting from fear, was fighting from clarity, from purpose, from the understanding that his marriage to Padmé had given him, that some things were worth defending, and defending them made you stronger, not weaker. The battle lasted 6 minutes. Palpatine's lightning cracked across the chamber. Mace Windu raised his guard, deflecting again and again. Yoda moved with a speed that belied his 900 years. His lightsaber meeting Sidious's power with mathematics made manifest. And Anakin waited for the moment of opening. It came when Palpatine, confident in his power, overextended, when he pushed his lightning output to levels that even the Force couldn't sustain forever, when the armor of his certainty developed, for a single moment, a crack. Anakin struck, not to kill, to open. His blade found the vulnerable moment, and he pressed forward with absolute commitment, with no hesitation, with the clarity that came from knowing he was making the right choice. Mace Windu seized the moment. His lightsaber drove forward. Palpatine's reflection was milliseconds too slow. The Sith Lord fell, but he did not die. He escaped, a distraction deployed with his last strength, a gesture that opened space around him, a moment of temporal dislocation that allowed him to withdraw, to flee, to disappear into the depths of Coruscant's industrial sector, leaving behind only the knowledge that he had been touched by mortality for the first time in years. When the dust settled, the count was devastating. 3,000 Jedi dead. The Order reduced from 10,000 to 7,000, and many of those survivors were traumatized, exhausted, uncertain of what came next. The Senate had fractured. Some senators had been Palpatine's allies and were now arrested or executed. Others were simply shocked into paralysis. The government was in chaos. The clone army was partially operational, but confused. Their programming activated only halfway through before the Jedi managed to create electronic interference that scrambled the activation protocols. Approximately 40% of the clone army was in open rebellion. 60% were following confused, conflicting orders from military commanders who didn't know what was real anymore. Padmé was alive, though she carried burn scars from the moment Anakin had thrown his body in front of her to protect her from Palpatine's lightning. She had fought alongside him in the final battle, her blaster's shots occasionally finding clone troopers when lightsabers couldn't be everywhere at once. And Anakin stood in the ruins of the temple, looking at what they'd won and understanding that victory and collapse were sometimes the same thing. 6 months after Palpatine's escape, the new Jedi Temple was nearly complete. Not restored, rebuilt. The architects had taken the opportunity to change the design fundamentally. Where the old temple had been a fortress, massive and isolated, the new one was more open, more connected to Coruscant around it, less hidden from the world. Yoda stood in the main meditation chamber, looking at the space that had been cleared for a new kind of teaching. Here, the ancient master said to Anakin and Padmé, who stood together as they now did everywhere, their marriage no longer something to be hidden, but something to be integrated into how the Order operated. We'll teach the next generation that attachment is not weakness. We'll need to develop new curriculum, Padmé said. The old teachings were based on the idea that Jedi should be isolated from their feelings. If we're changing that doctrine, everything changes. From the ground up, Anakin agreed. We teach emotional clarity instead of emotional suppression. We teach that love and duty can exist in the same person without conflict. Ahsoka joined them, her blue skin bright in the light of the new chamber. The young Togruta had survived the clone purge and had emerged with a clarity of purpose that suggested the chaos had crystallized something in her rather than breaking it. "Master," Ahsoka said to Anakin, "I wanted to tell you, I'm going to establish a second enclave, not in the temple. Somewhere separate, a place where Jedi can live with families, with partners, with normal lives integrated with Force training. A reformation within the Jedi," Padmé said, understanding immediately. "A revolution," Ahsoka corrected, "but quiet, sustainable. We'll show that Jedi can serve, can grow, can be whole people, not just warriors." Obi-Wan appeared in the chamber's entrance, and his presence carried a weight that suggested he'd been thinking deeply about something. "The High Council wants to discuss the future of the Order," he said. "Specifically, they want to propose that you," he looked at Anakin, "become a master, full voting member of the Council. Not because of your power, but because your decisions during the crisis saved the Order from complete annihilation." Anakin was silent for a moment. Then, "I'll accept, but only if Padmé has an official role too. This reformation of the Order can't happen if it's just driven by Jedi. We need outside perspective. We need the insight of people who love Jedi but aren't bound by all our traditional structures." "The Council won't approve that," Mace Windu said, appearing behind Obi-Wan. Apparently, approval had already been discussed, because the hard conversations had been happening for months while the temple was rebuilt. Giving a senator an official role in Jedi governance violates the separation between government and the separation that failed when the Chancellor was a Sith Lord, Anakin interrupted quietly. The separation that failed because the Jedi were isolated from political reality. We need integration, not separation. We need people who understand systems, who understand politics, who understand that governance affects the Force and the Force affects governance." Mace Windu was quiet. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right. The old way failed. We need something new." 3 years later, the new Jedi Order was smaller, about 6,000 strong across the entire galaxy, but stronger in ways that the metrics of power hadn't previously measured. Jedi trained now with partners and families in tow. The next generation of Force-sensitive children grew up in an environment where love was acknowledged rather than suppressed. The Order became more connected to the societies it served rather than isolated from them. Palpatine, still alive somewhere in the outer reaches of the galaxy, was reorganizing. The threat was not eliminated. It was simply transformed, made smaller, forced to operate from shadows rather than from the centers of power. But that meant the Jedi had time. Time to rebuild, time to change, time to evolve into something better than what had come before. Anakin stood in the training ground of the new temple, watching a class of young Jedi in their first lightsaber lessons. Among them was their own child, a girl, 5 years old, who showed every sign of Force sensitivity and who grew up in a world where being Anakin Skywalker's daughter and Padmé Amidala's daughter and a Jedi in training were not contradictions, but simply different facets of one whole identity. "You did this," Obi-Wan said, appearing beside him with the ease of long years of friendship. "We did this," Anakin corrected. "All of us. The council that accepted the marriage, Padmé for standing beside me, the Jedi who chose to fight rather than despair, the galaxy that demanded something better than what had been. Still," Obi-Wan insisted, "it started with you. With you and Padmé refusing to accept the old answer." Padmé joined them, watching their daughter attempt a basic kata with the seriousness that all 5-year-olds brought to anything their parents told them was important. "The galaxy is still in danger," Padmé observed. "Palpatine is still out there. We haven't won completely." "No," Anakin agreed. "But we won this. We won the right to choose, to love, to be whole people. That matters as much as any battle." Yoda walked past, slower than he had been 3 years ago, 903 years of age finally beginning to show. But his expression carried something like peace. "Right choice you made," the ancient master said to Anakin and Padmé. "Difficult choice, but right choice. The Order will heal. The Order will become what it was always meant to be, not a weapon, but a shield. Not a separation from the world, but an integration with it." "And when we fail again?" Anakin asked. "Because we will fail. Institutions always do. Then fail you will, differently," Yoda replied. "With honesty instead of hiding behind doctrine. With willingness to change instead of defending tradition for tradition's sake. That is all an institution can do, fail better than it failed before." The final image. Anakin and Padmé stand in the training ground as the sun sets over Coruscant, painting the city in colors that made it almost beautiful. Their daughter practices her lightsaber form, and they watch with the attentiveness of people who understand how much they sacrificed to make this moment possible. Obi-Wan stands nearby, no longer their teacher but their equal, their partner in the work of building something better. Yoda watches from the temple's upper levels, ancient and satisfied, understanding that the future was uncertain, but that uncertainty, when faced with honesty rather than hidden behind doctrine, was the only ground where real growth could happen. The clone army is being dismantled. Its soldiers offered the choice of remaining in military service or civilian life, a choice that Order 66 had tried to deny them, but which the reformed society had insisted on restoring. Palpatine is still alive, still dangerous, still plotting, but he is no longer inevitable. He is no longer victory made manifest. He is simply an enemy that needs to be opposed, and opposition makes space for choice, and choice makes space for growth. The transformation is incomplete, but it is real. A Jedi Order that learned to love, a man who chose clarity over desperation, a woman who stood beside him when the universe suggested she should step back, and a future that was uncertain but which was being built on honesty rather than hidden doctrine. That was the victory. That was the price worth paying. That was what happened when the Jedi accepted that attachment could be strength.